Toxic by Mark Frankland. Chapter 6. June 2014, the Midwest, the United States of America. Chad Forrester finally made his mind up about what to do when his plane was 37,000 feet above the mid-Atlantic. And once he'd settled on a plan of action, he eased his seat back and slept for the next 5 hours all the way to Chicago's O'Hare Airport. During the course of his 4.5 years training new entrants into the 101st Airborne, there had only ever been one recruit who Chad would have considered as a protégé. His name was Robert Jordan, and he reminded Chad a great deal of his own younger self. Both of them were country boys. Robert's family farmed cattle in Nebraska. Both had excelled in the field of science. Robert made top 5 in his year at the University of Nebraska studying chemistry, and both men had made the life choice of West Point, followed by the Screaming Eagles. Chad made sure that the young Jordan went through the torments of hell in the hills and woodlands that surrounded Fort Campbell, and never once came remotely close to breaking him. At the end of the course, the two men had shared several beers one night and established a friendship that had lasted for nearly 30 years. During those years, Robert Jordan had soared up the ranks and collected commendations every step of the way. He saw Desert Storm, Kosovo, Afghanistan and Iraq. In 2011 he finally made it all the way to the top of the tree when he was promoted to Major General and put in charge of the 101st. Along the way he acquired the nickname of Cyber Jordan as a result of his being instrumental in the Screaming Eagles becoming one of the most technologically advanced units in the US Army. The fact that a man like Robert Jordan could make it so seamlessly to the top did much to maintain Chad's faith in the army he had gone into the pit for. As far as Chad was concerned, Cyber Jordan was pretty well the perfect soldier. He was smart, tough, hard, and courageous. More importantly, he was a man with a steel rod of a moral core running through him. A man of God, a patriot. He was what an American soldier was supposed to be like. Chad would happily have trusted him with his life. Now he decided to trust him with something rather different. He called Louise from O'Hare and told her that he was safely back on US soil but wouldn't be back home for a couple of days. She asked him if everything was okay, and he promised her that it was, and he could tell that she didn't believe a word of it. Thankfully, Louise was a soldier's wife twice over. She knew how it was, and after this particular road trip she would never have to feel this way again. He was 68 years old, for Christ's sakes. This would be his final mission, his final duty. He took the journey south to Kentucky slowly, using back roads. It gave him time to get his thoughts properly organised. The radio was alive with the breaking news of the release of Sergeant Bo Bergdahl after 5 years of incarceration with the Taliban. At least it seemed like some things remained sacred. It had been at the core of everything they had ever done in Vietnam. Nobody got left behind. Well, not until every gut had been busted. The guys who drove the dust-off medevac choppers had been the real superheroes to every grunt who had done their time in country. He bridled as caller after caller berated the president for being soft on terrorism and releasing 5 Taliban leaders in exchange for Bergdahl. Assholes. He knew for certain that none of them had ever served anywhere. Typical TV soldiers. Like any real soldier, he knew the rules. Everybody goes home. Nobody left behind. Not ever. He checked into a hotel 50 miles north of Fort Campbell and ate a steak before going to bed just after 10. The next day he automatically reverted to his familiar dawn rise, and he arrived at the camp gates a little after 7:30. "Good morning, Corporal." "Morning, sir. How can I help you?" "I would like you to pass a message to Major General Jordan, please. Tell him that Chad Forrester is here to visit with him. And please tell him that Chad Forrester considers it pretty important we meet straight away. Do you have that, Corporal?" "You want me to tell that to the Major General, sir?" "Yes, I do, Corporal." "So you don't have an appointment, sir?" "No, Corporal, I don't." The big face at the window creased with unease. Sir, I don't believe that will be possible at this time. The Major General... Yeah, Corporal, I know the Major General is a busy guy. Of course he's a busy guy. He runs the 101st, right? That he does, sir, and I'm afraid there is no question of you visiting with the Major General without an appointment at this time. Okay, thought Chad. So that's the way you want to play it. So, let's play. Now I suggest you listen up pretty good, Corporal, because right now your sorry-ass career is hanging by a thread. 20 years before your ma even dreamed of bringing your fat ass into this big bad world, I was leading a bunch of eagles up to the top of Hamburger Hill. Maybe you've heard of it, soldier. It was what you might call a firefight. And we won it. We had our rendezvous with destiny, and we prevailed. I left 8 guys and about 3 pints of blood on that goddamn hill, soldier, and I might be 68 years old, but I figure I could still snap that fat neck of yours in about 30 seconds. So I earnestly suggest that you get your ass inside right now and make the fucking call. The corporal made the call, and 10 minutes later Chad was in Major General Robert Cyber Jordan's office. Chad's old protege looked absurdly fit for a man of 51 years old, and he wore a baked tan from the Afghan mountains. Chad, great to see you. Here, let me clear this shit out of the way. There you go. Sit here. Take a load off. Coffee, right? Yeah, coffee would be great. You eating, Chad? You had breakfast? I have, thanks. You look well, Robert. Well, I guess so. All that Afghani sunshine. Yeah, I read about it. Chad always read about it, every day without fail, whenever the men of his 101st were deployed. The last tour had been a bad one. 6 guys had returned in flag-draped coffins. 32 had returned with intravenous drips putting saline solution into their wrecked bodies. Yeah, I guess you did. It wasn't a real good one, Chad. I figure you'd read between the lines. Chad shrugged. No, it wasn't hard. We got Victor Charlie, you got the guys from the Taliban. What is that saying those Talibans have? You got all the clocks, and we got all the time. Yeah, well, I guess it's all done now. The Eagles won't be going back there any time. We played our part. Chad nodded. Coffee arrived, and the 2 men took a moment to add cream and sugar. Well, the way you scared the living shit out of my guy at the gate makes me think this probably isn't a social call, chap. The older man shook his head. Okay, then. Here's how things stand. I got some pretty big hitting Washington bean counter through the door in 35 minutes. Is that long enough, or do I need to free up some time later on? No, 35 minutes should be fine. Want me to make my pitch? Sure. The floor is yours, Chad. Chad took a sip of steaming coffee and then put the cup down on a highly polished coffee table that separated the 2 men. I'm sorry to bring this to you, Robert, real sorry. I'm old and I'm way out of the loop. Not that I was ever really in the loop. I was never close to getting as high as you. Jordan shrugged. That wasn't down to you, Chad. Your pa died. You did the right thing for your family. I'd like to think I'd do the same thing if I had to. Well, it doesn't matter anyhow. All that matters is that you're the only person who I can think of to bring this to. You see, this isn't just about seniority, Robert. This is about having the heart to do the right thing. The Major General frowned. You're going to hand me a barrel load of shit, aren't you? Sure am. Well, go on then. Okay. This is about a mission I carried out back in 81. I wasn't with the 101st then. It was a Delta mission. Maybe it's best if I start with some background. That okay? Yeah, it's okay. Those were the times when the Cold War was still pretty darn hot. All the experts thought we were 50-50 at best with the Soviets. They had all the men and the tanks and the artillery pieces. Hell, it even looked like they were about to catch up with our Navy. Remember, this was the year before Israel invaded Lebanon. Cyber Jordan knew the relevance of that fact. It was his kind of fact. In 1981, America was still bruised. The defeat in Vietnam and the fiasco of their efforts to rescue the hostages in Tehran had left the army bereft of confidence. The Red Army had looked pretty damn formidable back then. All projections from the Pentagon war games suggested that the Soviets could be at the Channel Coast in less than a week, should they'd ever chosen to let their tanks roll. The view from the Pentagon had been bleak. The view was that there would have to have been a pretty black and white choice made if those tanks were ever fired up and pointed west. You either give up on Europe or go nuclear. But then Israel invaded the Lebanon and everything changed. The Soviets had been waiting on this moment. They had sent 100 of their very best shiny new MiGs to Syria. More than that, they had also sent along the best pilots they had to do the flying. As soon as the Israeli Defense Forces breached the border, the MiGs took to the skies to take on the American-built F-16s, flown by American-trained Israeli pilots. Both sides had been waiting patiently for this dress rehearsal for World War III. A few hours later, an inescapable truth had emerged. 87 MiGs had been shot from the sky. Not a single F-16 had been shot from the sky. One F-16 had crashed and burned as a result of pilot error. In a few short hours in the blue skies of the Middle East, it had become clear to one and all that the Warsaw Pact was light years behind NATO in terms of technology. And everything changed. New war games revealed new truths. War games waged in Moscow and Washington came up with the same answers. If the Red Army ever threw its tanks into West Germany, they'd have no air cover whatsoever. It would be a turkey shoot. The Red Army would be completely wiped. Soon people got to thinking if the new MiGs were such a piece of shit, then logic suggested that the tanks and the subs and the nukes were more than likely to be a piece of shit as well. To all intents and purposes, the Cold War was won and lost on that day in 1982. From that day forth, there was only going to be one winner. But nobody knew that in the summer of 1981. In the summer of 1981, the might of the Red Army looked pretty darned real to an America that had recently had its ass kicked out of Vietnam. Yeah, I remember Lebanon, how it changed everything. Chad nodded. So, I was in Delta. I got word to report to the Pentagon to meet Admiral Douglas MacIver. Remember him? Jordan raised a surprised eyebrow. Sure, I remember him. He was a big hitter. He was Al Haig's guy, right? Wasn't he tipped to make it all the way to chairman of the Joint Chiefs? Yep, and he would have made it, no doubt about it. But he took a heart attack. It ended his chances at the top job. I never knew that. Chat smiled. I guess it never made the Washington Post. So, I arrived at the Pentagon and Doug MacIver briefed me one-to-one. Jesus, Chat, there's nobody else there? Not a soul. It was just me and Doug. He told me what we hadn't really met at all. All right, I see. It was one of those. Yeah, it was one of those. Anyways, he took some time to tell me that there are a lot of people in Washington who were getting kind of worried about the Brits. What kind of people? Chat shrugged. He never gave me in black and white. No names, just lines to read between. And who did the writing? It was the Holy Trinity. Pentagon, Langley, White House. I got the firm impression that the White House was right in point, out in front. I was left with a pretty firm impression that the whole thing was down to Al Haig. Okay, go on. It's easy to forget that things were pretty hairy back in Britain in 1981. Thatcher was on her ass. There were riots everywhere and unemployment was through the roof. Most of the guys around her were plotting how to stab her in the back, and the government was 20-something points behind in the polls. Doug told me that the smart money was on the Conservatives getting completely screwed over when the next election came round. And that would have meant Labour, right? Well, we didn't like the British Labour Party much back then. There's still a lot of anger about Harold Wilson pissing us about when we asked for a bit of help in Nam. Doug told me that MI5 had been working pretty close with the guys over at Langley in the 70s. There were more than a few British spooks who were pretty sure that Wilson was Moscow's guy. They needed to get rid of him, and Langley helped them to do it. But by 1981, things had got a whole lot worse. We were pretty sure that Moscow had completely infiltrated the British Labour Party over the years, and now here they were looking like a shoo-in to take power with a huge majority. Jordan nodded slowly. There ain't no House of Representatives in Britain, right? No checks and balances? Right. Power means absolute power. Look at Blair. So, Chad, what in particular had the White House shitting its pants so bad? Chad shrugged again. The nukes, of course. Everything was about nukes back then. The nukes were the only card we thought we'd get to play. We were still pretty sure that we had managed to stay a few years ahead of the Sovs in nuclear field. If it ever came down to a nuclear exchange, then we'd get hit hard, why they would get wiped off the map completely. A new Labour government threatened all of that. A Labour government could invite their buddies in Moscow to come visit with them, right? You can put the rest of the pieces together, Robert. Jordan nodded. This was his arena, the high-tech arena. The arena where the guy with the shiniest new toys would always kick the ass of the guy who had to make do with last year's toys. Yeah, I see it. Moscow sends its best scientists and they get themselves a nice look-see at Uncle Sam's best and newest technology. Then they copy it, then we lose our last trump card. I guess people must have been getting pretty agitated. As far as I recall, back then the nukes were still ours, weren't they? Didn't we just kind of, lend them to the Brits? That's correct. We still had Polaris back then. We owned them lock, stock, and barrel. They signed a sort of lease agreement to carry on them on their submarines. Yeah, and the whole shooting match was to be found at that base at Fast Lane, right? It was. So, everybody's scared shitless, and they call you in. Chad Forster, the Delta Force. What the hell did they get you to do, chap? They got me to buy them an insurance policy. I was chosen because I'd studied math at university. They put me on an intensive 2-week course so I could pass as a technician going into Fastlane to work on the nukes. That's how they got me in. And once you're on the inside, what did the insurance policy look like? Chad sat back in a deep leather chair and stared up at the ceiling for a few seconds. When he eventually spoke, his voice was much quieter. They identified this shitty old shed. It had been disused for years and years. They reckoned it was something from World War II. My mission was to make my way to the shed under the cover of darkness and bury a package around back. Cyber Jordan was already beginning to guess what was coming next. His voice fell to the same pitch as Chad's. Package? Yep, a package. Just under 50 pounds, all locked up in a shiny metal case. That was a suitcase, Newt, Robert. Jordan blew his cheeks out and got to his feet. He paced the room for a while. He took a moment at the window and watched a column of soldiers jogging. He spoke with his back still turned to the older man. I guess it made sense. Tell me if I have this wrong. If the Labour Party won power and invited scientists from Moscow into Fastlane, then we'd have detonated and the whole thing would have looked like some kind of huge nuclear accident. No more Fastlane. No more American toys to be picked apart. No more problem. Yeah, that was about the shape of it. And you buried the nuke? Yes, Robert. I completed the mission. Then what? Chad shrugged. Then nothing. I came back home. A few weeks later, I busted up my ankle pretty bad and I had to leave Delta. Came back to the 101st. You know the rest. Yeah, I guess I do. You still smoke, Chad? Sure. I thought you gave up. I relapsed in Kandahar. Jordan pulled an ashtray from his office drawer and put it down on the coffee table. He lit up and tossed the pack over to Chad to do the same. So, this was 33 years ago, ancient history, and yet here you are threatening to break my gate corporal's neck. What's changed the game, Chad? That was a CNN documentary. It was all about the vote they're about to have in Scotland in September. Yeah, I know, for independence, right? Yeah, and the parties who are campaigning for the yes vote have made a big promise about the future of nukes in Scotland. There won't be one. The government of an independent Scotland will require and request the people in London to take their nukes away and put them somewhere else. Fast Lane will be converted into the new country's naval base. Right now, any hits on a Geiger counter won't mean a whole lot. It's a nuke base, right? Once all the nukes have been taken away, that little Obama mine is going to throw out one hell of a signature. And then they're going to dig for it, Robert. And it won't take them very long to find out who made the thing, and who put it there, and why. All of the Afghan colour drained from the face of Major General Robert Cyber Jordan. Ah, holy shit! They were quiet for a while. Jordan shook his head from side to side, slowly, very deliberately. You reckon we could put something in place to go get the thing back? Chad shook his head. There's no chance. It was the first thing I thought of, so I took a trip over to Scotland. I just got back yesterday. I managed to get myself a pretty good look down into the base. The shed ain't there anymore. They've knocked it down and put a porta-cabin on the site. The porta-cabin is sitting on 4 concrete posts, one on each corner. Thankfully, they didn't dig out any foundations. They'd gone for a concrete base. Well, they'd have found the nuke. I guess we got kind of lucky. Could a guy get underneath? Is there any crawl space? Nah, it looked like about 6 inches to me. And the case is pretty heavy. Someone would have to more or less dig a tunnel. I can't see any safe way a mission like that could be completed. One of our guys getting caught in the act would be a catastrophe. Ain't that the goddamn truth? So, you got any thoughts, Chad? You're still my go-to guy when it comes to scenarios. That's why you gotten yourself so filthy rich trading those corn futures. You've thought it through, right? Played it out. I have. As far as I can see, there's only one real option. But first up, tell me something, Robert. Has your creed changed? Or is it the same as before? The Major General had often talked his creed through with his old mentor. Jordan's years in the 101st had taken him to the worst places in the world, and he'd seen the very worst of mankind, the killing, the torture, the ethnic cleansing, all of it. He'd seen what the world looked like when human beings made like packs of hungry wolves. His view of the future was logical, pessimistic, and bleak. He saw the world that was becoming dangerously overpopulated. He saw a world which would soon be unable to grow enough food for everyone to eat enough to survive. He saw a world where the key resources were becoming ever scarcer, particularly oil, water, and food. He saw a world where all these growing pressures would persuade men to turn those with increasingly extreme answers to increasingly desperate questions. Religious maniacs, far-right groups, fast-talking dictators. Robert Jordan foresaw a world where the fight for dwindling resources would lead to massive bloodshed and general anarchy. And he could only see one ray of hope in this apocalyptic future, one solitary beacon of light: the United States military. His United States military. They would be the only show in town, the only guys wearing white hats with the kind of firepower needed to save mankind from mankind. These were thoughts Jordan never ever shared in public. To do so would mean getting painted as some kind of nut in the media. Instead, he'd only ever worked his vision of the future through with his old mentor, Chad Forrester. And his old mentor hadn't disagreed. Both men retained a faith in the very same US military that had once helped consign the Nazis to the dustbin of history, and were it required to do the same again in the years to come, it would come through. The problem was that the US military was heading into pretty heavy seas. Iraq and Afghanistan had not been complete failures like Vietnam, but they hadn't been any kind of victories either. And then there'd been all the other stuff, an endless drip of damaging shit. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, WikiLeaks, Edward Snowden, drone strikes, Blackwater. The US military was losing its popularity at an alarming rate of knots. All of a sudden, politicians of all colours were starting to ask more and more questions about all the big bucks being spent. The future of the American military was looking far from secure, and as far as Robert Jordan was concerned, that meant that the future of mankind was also questionable. He didn't need Chad to spell it out. The worldwide media storm that would follow the discovery of an American suitcase nuclear weapon buried under the soil of its country's oldest ally would be an utter disaster. Another utter disaster. Yeah, my creed is unchanged, completely unchanged. And yes, Chad, I can see how it would look if this thing all came out. It would be a disaster. So I guess you want to see if I can find a way of doing what needs to be done. Is that right, Chad? That's right. That's why I've come. So what needs to be done? I hope and hell you're not about to suggest we detonate the goddamn thing. No, I'm not suggesting that. Before getting to my thoughts about potential solutions, I figure it might be worth assessing how things stand right now. Go on. None of this is fact, Robert. These are just my assumptions. The only fact I ever knew was that I buried that case under that shed. McIver dropped a few hints when he briefed me. It was a need-to-know thing, and it didn't seem like many people ever needed to know. Someone in the White House, probably Al Haig or an other. Someone in Langley and one or two in the Pentagon. What we need to remember is how quickly things changed. Less than a year after I did my thing, the Brits won their war in the Falklands, and all of a sudden everyone was in love with the Iron Maiden. Thatcher won the '83 election by a landslide, and the Labour Party fell apart like a complete sack of shit. And everything changed on our side of the pond as well. All of a sudden Thatcher was the biggest show in town. Reagan just loved her, and together they rode out and won the Cold War. Just imagine how embarrassing it would have been had anyone heard that we'd buried a suitcase nuke in their nuclear sub-base. So my guess is that people would have worked pretty hard on forgetting the whole thing ever happened. If there were any papers, they'd have all gotten shredded and burned. And then the odds are that the main players would have started to die. Doug McIver's dead, Al Haig's dead. Maybe all of the others who knew the secret are dead and gone as well. Maybe I'm the only one left. It's a pretty strong possibility. Yeah, and that means? It means that I doubt very much if you'll find anyone who's high up who'll be willing to hear about this. It's toxic. Robert, it's as toxic can ever get. Yeah, I can see that. So, your only option is to try and find yourself someone who is down the chain some, a fellow traveler, a kindred spirit, someone who buys into that creed of yours. Yeah, I mean someone who's in a position to make the call and do something off the books. That's right. That is exactly right. Jordan got up from his chair again and went back over to the window. He stood very straight with his hands clasped behind his back. And what do we need to do, Chad? What kind of off-the-record black op are we talking here? From where I'm sitting, there only seems to be two choices. One, we detonate the nuke and wipe the slate clean forever. The same old cover story would work every bit as well now as it did in 1981. A terrible accident, an unimaginable human tragedy. But we can't do that, Robert. To do that would be an obscenity, unacceptable. You agree? Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. So, that leaves us with one last option. We find a way to make sure that the people of Scotland vote no on September the 18th. If they vote no, then nothing changes. The status quo will have another 50 years worth of shelf life, and our secret can stay buried. Yeah, maybe not forever, but long enough for it not to be so bad when the truth eventually comes out. A no vote? Yep, a no vote. Jesus H. Christ.
Toxic by Mark Frankland. Chapter 7. June 2014, London. Without knowing it, and let's face it, how could she have done, Cathy eventually decided on a similar course of action to Chad. There was a subtle difference.
Chad Forrester took his problem to a person who had once upon a time been a protege of his. Cathy didn't have any proteges. Her career was far too young for that kind of thing. What she did have, however, was a mentor, who she believed considered her to be something of a protege of his. Well, she certainly hoped so. It had been just past midnight when she decided that she'd sucked Google Drive all information it held about Chad Forrester of Missouri. She hadn't managed to sleep a great deal that night, and as she made her way into Thames House the following morning, she made the decision not to share her findings with her much-hated supervisor, Maurice Hemp. She had come to the opinion that by keeping things to herself, she was absolutely doing the right thing. Her thought process had been logical in every respect. Well, she thought so. She was the bright young thing from Hertfordshire with a starred first and a rich daddy. They rated her brains, but suspected her upbringing. Was she too spoilt, too soft, too Harper's and Queen? And so, to test her mettle, they had placed her in the tender care of Maurice Hemp and instructed him to be as boorish and ghastly as possible. No doubt they had also ordered him to keep her on a constant diet of tedious trivia, which was of no interest to anyone. Test her out, Maurice. Stretch her as far as you can go, and if she snaps, then so be it. Plenty more fish in the sea, Maurice. Oh, she got it, and accepted that it did make a degree of sense, even though it was all rather Victorian public school. But there was a problem. The video and audio from Fastlane Peace Camp had already been deemed to be utterly worthless. This was exactly why they had been given to her. Were she could take her concerns to Hemp, he would follow the script he had been given, and follow it to the letter. He would mock her, laugh at her, and do all he could to publicly humiliate her and make her feel about half an inch tall. None of that mattered to Cathy King in the slightest. What did matter was the fact that the information would get buried about 10 miles deep in the basement. And ever since her night spent opening the doors into the life and times of Chad Forrester, an alarm bell had been ringing away somewhere in the back of her brain. To describe the alarm would require the use of words like feeling and instinct. These were the kinds of words that Maurice Hemp hated with a boiling passion. These were the kind of words that would get Maurice Hemp throwing coffee cups around the place. He demanded facts, he demanded structure and framework and logical progression. There was no room in the world of Maurice Hemp for any of his people having a gut feeling. So, Cathy kept Chad all to herself. And so she clocked in and clocked out and worked her way through a series of tedious and worthless tasks without ever engaging her brain. Instead, she sought a way forward. The solution came to her after 2 days, but it took another week for her to summon up the nerve to seek it out. She booked a day off and made a call to Magdalen College, Cambridge, with held breath. The call went well, it went fine. It went better than she could have realistically hoped for, and when she ended the call, she had the appointment she sought. She left early and caught a train from Liverpool Street just after 8 o'clock. It was a gorgeous spring morning, and through the train's windows the flatlands of Essex were showing early signs of crops to come. For hundreds of years the region had been known as Constable Country. It was the very essence of the English countryside. But things had changed. Now the media painted this region of sprawling grain fields as being the very heart of UKIP land. A few days earlier, Britain's largest party of the right had seen its swelling balloon finally popped in the Newark by-election. Would that be the beginning of the end of their story, or were they about to join Sir Oswald Mosley and the National Front and the BNP in the dustbin of history? Or would history judge Newark as nothing more than a small setback? She thought about taking a taxi, but decided to walk instead, and used the time to quieten down her nerves. She stopped for a coffee. She checked her hair in the ladies. She took time out to watch the ducks from Magdalen Bridge. She checked her watch. 10:30. Showtime, Cathy. An oldish man with brill-creamed hair checked the appointments book in the porter's lodge, and then placed a muttered call. Sir Nigel says you can go on up. Take the third door on the right, and the courtyard leads up on the first floor. And with that he returned to the back page of the Daily Express. A stone arch opened into First Court and transported her back
to the days of the Spanish Armada. The sounds of the streets outside were instantly swallowed up by a timeless silence. The stairway was a rickety affair, and a beaming Sir Nigel Telford was waiting for her when she reached the top. "What an absolute treat to see you, my dear. I was so thrilled to get your call. Please come along, come inside. Here we are, splendid." He was a thin, wrinkly man, almost swallowed by a worn tweed suit. He had 91 years on the clock, and his smiling face showed a record of each and every one of them. He had been the star turn of her training package, a guest speaker, a hinted-at superstar. Bill Lazenby, the senior course organiser, had been dramatically vague when he introduced Sir Nigel and made quite sure that everyone in the lecture hall was completely aware that they were in the presence of one of the great ones. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my very greatest pleasure to introduce you all to a man the likes of whom none of us will ever see again. Sir Nigel was in Prague in 1942, East Berlin in 1953, and Warsaw in 1968. I cannot speak of any of the work he did, and neither can he. I expect all of you to listen and learn and absorb." Telford had got to his feet and ticked off Lazenby for such a gross exaggeration, and then went on to speak for 2 hours, without either notes nor pause. He gave his talk the working title of Background Music. His premise was a simple one. In order to understand any group of given facts, you must always take time out to listen to what background music might have been playing at the time. Who was on top of the pops? What were they wearing? How many records did they sell? Who bought their records? How much did they cost? Who was the producer? Were they a one-hit wonder? He believed that facts on their own seldom made any sense. To properly understand the meaning of any fact, you always had to be fully understanding the context. Cathy had hung back to ask a couple of supplementary questions, and Sir Nigel had been more than happy to stay back with her. He asked Lazenby if it would be acceptable if he stole Miss King away from the course for a couple of hours, and Lazenby said it would be quite acceptable. At the end of their first little chat, Sir Nigel arranged for Cathy to visit him in his rooms in Cambridge on a weekly basis, which she duly did. She suspected this was all part of the service's way of testing her out. Telford was the carrot to Hemp's stick. Was her apparent brilliance merely the brilliance of the academic world, or did her brilliance have new horizons yet to be reached? For 6 months she made the weekly trips up to Cambridge, and then the visits ceased. Was that because she had passed or failed? Nobody ever said, and maybe there hadn't even been a test at all. It was all a part of the strange smoke and mirrors world she had chosen to join. She smiled at the familiar chaos of his room as he fussed about with a kettle and teacups. "You know the drill. Clear away whatever needs clearing. Find a pew, take a load off. Quite lovely out there, isn't it? My old bones crave the warmth of a spring sun more than ever. No sugar, of course, no sugar. Nobody ever seems to take any sugar anymore. I gather from the newspapers that the NHS has decided that sugar is the new heroin. What a terrible shame." How many words must have passed his lips in the course of his 91 years? Millions upon millions. The fact that his sagging bookshelves were laden with books in German, Russian and French as well as English hinted that many of this garrulous little man's words must have been spoken in a foreign tongue. She sat and waited patiently for the well-worn tea-making routine to run its course. Finally he plonked a cup down on top of a page filled with scrawled notes and took a seat opposite hers. "So, my dear, is this a purely social call, or have you come to rail at the attentions of the ghastly Mr. Hemp?" She laughed. "Oh, you know about Morris, then?" "Oh, I do indeed. A truly horrid little man in almost every regard, but surprisingly good at his job, annoyingly good. Hemp knows how to sort the wheat from the chaff. From what little I hear, and believe me, it is very little indeed, Mr. Hemp is rather inclined to the view that you are wheat, my dear. So hang on valiantly, and things will improve." "Well, thank you kindly for that, but it isn't the reason for my visit." Old eyes twinkled with anticipation. "Oh, how intriguing, how thrilling, in fact. It is so very rare that anybody bothers to come and see me with anything exciting any more. The floor is absolutely yours, my dear. Take all the time you need. I'm all ears." Cathy took 30 minutes, and she took him through her investigation chronologically. He clapped his hands in glee when she painted a picture of Chad considering wearing his Stetson hat, before thinking the better of it. "Oh my, what a wonderful detail, and what a treasure of a man. I like him already, my dear. I'm quite ready to become a camp follower. He left his hat on the back seat. How simply marvellous." Words from the bugged communal area, words of long past wars, traces of sadness, hints of unhealed wounds. He purred with pride when she explained how she had identified the Overlook lay-by scanning the day records of the police. He nodded thoughtfully at the old photo of a young Chad Forrester, looking uneasy and embarrassed in the company of the beaming mayor of Harpersville. When she arrived at the MOD record of the joint SAS Delta training exercise in Amman, he clapped his hands in delight. "And so we draw ever nearer to the secret heart of Mr. Chad Forrester of Harpersville, Missouri, a Delta man no less. Oh my goodness me, this really is quite splendid." When she moved along to the record of Chad, the supposed nuclear technician, visiting HNB Clyde in the summer of 1981, he was a great deal less histrionic. Oh dear, so our intrepid cowboy went into the very dark heart of the beast. And he was pretending to be somebody else, deceiving, a false identity, a legend. And of course, having been such a splendid mathematics student, he could have played the part with a great aplomb. It seems that our dear friends from across the Atlantic must have chosen very carefully indeed. My, how they must have scoured the land for their warrior with a penchant for mathematics. And we must not forget that it was an ominous time indeed when our hero ventured into the very darkest corner of our sceptred isle. I must be very honest with you, my dear. I hate the nuclear world. I have always hated the nuclear world, and I have never made any secret about my feelings. It caused me some difficulties at the time, but there we are. It's enough of me. Tell me about the background music, my dear. Paint me a picture. Kathy painted her picture. A country almost at the edge. Domino riots in the cities, angry punk music, mayhem in Ulster, horrors in Soviet-occupied Afghanistan, an aging B-movie actor in the White House, a beleaguered housewife from Grantham in Downing Street, a government hated by one and all for its perceived cruelty, long queues at the dole offices, nationalised industries creaking at the seams, decay and collapse and anger, and the smell of a coming revolution? Maybe. Certainly the red tops of the day were to be taken seriously, and Moscow pulling the strings of the Labour Party? Hard to believe with the benefit of hindsight, but there were plenty who suspected it to be so at the time. At which point Telford thumped the table and caused his teacup to rattle on its saucer. And there we have it. There we absolutely have it, my dear. You have reached the very heart of the matter. There were plenty who suspected it to be so at the time. How very right you are. I might just make a moment to bask in your glory, for you have shown that I have taught you well. Only a close and forensic study of the background music could have guided you to such a eureka moment, and how right you are. I know, you see, I was there. I can remember those very people were saying in vivid detail, and it wasn't just in London. It was in Washington as well. In all of those fine, gleaming white buildings, there was much talk about the word red. We had the red peril. We had reds under the bed. They were truly hysterical times, my dear. Truly hysterical. And in the midst of these times of paranoia and hysteria, someone, somewhere, told Chad Forrester of the state of Missouri and the United States Army Delta Force to assume a false identity and venture into the very heart of our nuclear fortress on the banks of Gare Loch. Kathy had to work hard not to make her relief too obvious. She hadn't been a fool after all, and her instincts about Hemp and his designated role were also magnificently confirmed. Life was looking up. Telford framed a wry smile with his dry old lips. "So, Miss King, so far you have cleared every hurdle, you have passed every test. You are in the finishing straight and the wind is in your hair, but there are still a couple of hurdles waiting to trip you up. Are you to soar magnificently, or are you to fall tragically short? Kathy frowned. Kathy started to rack her brain. Was there more? The small smile on Telford's face suggested there was. Could she have missed? What particular song from the summer of 1981 could she have Googled the lyrics for? A silence started to stretch out, and Sir Nigel allowed his shrunken frame to ease back into his chair. Outside the window, a bird was scratching in the thick ivy. An old dusty clock ticked out the seconds. Kathy closed her eyes and concentrated and pictured a jigsaw that was just one piece short of a complete picture. Wait a minute here. You didn't need the last piece of a jigsaw to see the picture. The picture could easily be seen once the jigsaw was 75% complete. The final pieces were only down to thoroughness, a feeling of completeness, the satisfaction of a job absolutely done. Maybe she had already listened enough to songs from the summer of 1981 to have as good a picture as she was ever going to get. So what on earth was Sir Nigel hinting at? Oh, of course. How on earth could she have become so distracted? But almost straight away she knew only too well why she had become so distracted. It was 1981. It was the wildness of those times, the sense of anger and edge, the YouTube images of rioting streets and mass demonstrations, a Britain on the edge, her Britain, a Britain that was a million light years away from the leafy streets of Rickmansworth. The background music from 1981 had become as addictive to her as crystal meth, all-consuming. It had taken her in and got her hooked by its very anarchy. It had robbed her of her perspective, her clarity, her ability to take a step back and to look at the big picture. And of course there was a big picture to look at. A huge, vast, sprawling picture that told the story of the world in the 33 years that had passed since the summer of 1981. And there was no need to trawl back into the mist of time to look at this particular picture. And there was no need to seek out half-forgotten songs from half-forgotten bands in the dustier corners of YouTube. Instead, all she needed to do was switch on the TV and watch the news. Today's news, and all she needed to do was to leave a radio on in the kitchen in order to create the background music she had forgotten to look at. I forgot to listen to today's background music. But you have remembered now, so I can still bask. Is it loud, my dear? Has it set off the first alarm yet? A distant sound from a street on the other side of town? And will you soon realise that every alarm in the street will be screaming out a truly horrible sound? Are your ears beginning to hurt yet, my dear? Oh yes, they were beginning to hurt. They were suddenly hurting like they were about to rupture with the noise in her head. It's the referendum, isn't it? Oh yes, my dear. It is indeed the referendum. What else could it be? Why else would our gallant Chad travel so many miles to stand in a high place and be told off by armed policemen? What was he looking for in the dark heart of our nuclear kingdom? And why was it suddenly so important to him after 33 years? And why was his soul so restless that he chose to visit with the good people in the peace camp? There can only be one answer to every question. The referendum. That stark and unavoidable date with destiny on the 18th of September. And what happens if the people of Scotland decide to call time on the United Kingdom? They will order the government in Westminster to remove all Trident missiles. They will indeed. Every last one. And our dark nuclear kingdom will be no more. The caverns of Coolport will be left for the bats, and Her Majesty's naval base Clyde will become the home of a young country's naval forces, and that, of course, will mean a great deal of upheaval, and you know how it is when people move out of a house they've lived in for many years, don't you, Kathy? Kathy did. All sorts of stuff turns up. Stuff from the attic, stuff from the garden shed that has become a junk store. They were well and truly on the same page now. Sir Nigel picked up the thread. And maybe, way back in the summer of 1981, the son of the house had fallen into some bad company, and he'd worried his mum and dad sick. Who were those horrible new friends from the nearby council estate? Why was their treasured boy so in thrall with their foul-mouthed aggression? And maybe one of those newfound friends had been a very naughty, drug-dealing sort of friend. And maybe this naughty friend saw an opportunity. Maybe he hid away a packet of very naughty cocaine under the bedroom floorboards whilst the son of the house was down in the kitchen heating up a pizza. But then the naughty drug-dealing friend was arrested for beating up some poor soul who owed him some money, remanded into custody, no bail, a judge with no time for such violence, a 10-year sentence, a life sentence, because the naughty drug-dealing friend is killed in a vicious little fight in 1988. And the son of the house? Well, the son of the house turns everything around. He goes to university, becomes a chartered accountant, gets married, has children, and lives happily ever after. And then, after 33 years, his widowed mother decides to sell the house and downsize to something more manageable. Will anybody lift the loose floorboard in the bedroom that once upon a time had posters of the Sex Pistols on the wall? Maybe not, but they might. Who can possibly say? And just imagine all the fuss if they do lift the floorboards and discover a half kilogram of 1981 vintage lurking below. More silence. More seconds ticked by. They both knew well enough there wasn't a great deal more to say. The background music had cleared away the clouds and given them a blurred picture. For background music on its own could not possibly bring the close detail of the picture into sharper focus. That would require different methods. Sir Nigel Telford nodded to himself and sat up straighter. Right, here is what I will try and make happen. I will organise for you to be released from your time with Mr. Hemp. You will move to a flat here in Cambridge and report to me and only me. There will be errands to run and you will run them. It goes without saying that you will not discuss this with a single solitary living soul, or it will be the Tower of London for you, young lady. It will be off with your head. Are you ready for what is coming? Suddenly the room felt a little cold to Cathy King. Suddenly her twinkling, warm-hearted mentor was showing some much harder edges. I think so. I think so too. So good. Very good. You'd best head back to Thames House. By the time you arrive, I'll have spoken with certain people. Be nice, be polite, be evasive. Pick up your stuff, pack a suitcase and come straight back to Cambridge. I will call you with an address. I'll see you here at 9 a.m. Good enough? Yes, fine. Cathy stood up from her chair and left in a daze. The girl from the nice suburbs of Rickmansworth suddenly found herself in a very different world. Telford sat for a while and stared at the door his young protégé had walked through. For a moment his own mind wandered back through the decades. The real reason he had taken to Cathy King was the memory of a Cathy from times gone by, a young lady from nice parents and a nice home, a young lady with a brain like a computer and the courage of a lion. Emmeline Hatfield Barnes. She'd been parachuted into the hills outside of Prague in 1942, and for a few months she had shone and burned like a newly born star. And then the Gestapo had got hold of her, and they had broken her into a million screaming pieces, and when they had sucked her soul dry, they had dispatched her with a single bullet to the back of her head. It had taken him a long time to forgive himself for Emmeline, and now he was about to send another courageous young lady to the very darkest place in the United Kingdom, the nuclear place.